The steel hum of rain on tin roofs became the only sound in the Ohio River Valley, steady, relentless, without pause. January 5th, 1937, and the water levels began to rise, inch by silent inch, like breath held too long. Men walked to work in drizzle, women hung laundry beneath gray skies, children splashed in puddles that never dried. No one thought much of it. The river had flooded before, 40 times in Cincinnati's history, always rising, always falling, always obeying some unspoken law. But this time the river had forgotten how to stop. By January 10th, the National Weather Bureau issued flood warnings printed in small type on back pages of newspapers that were damp before they left the press. The rain drummed harder, 12 consecutive days, 15 inches in Louisville alone. In Cincinnati, over 13 inches fell in less than 2 weeks, more than 4 times the normal January rainfall. The ground, already saturated from earlier storms, could drink no more. Water pooled in basements, streets became streams. And still the rain fell, monotonous as a metronome, tapping on windows, on roofs, on the swelling surface of the Ohio River that curved through 5 states like a dark vein. You're inside this moment now. Stay with us. What happens next changed everything. 3 weeks earlier, the valley had been cold and ordinary. Men worked factory shifts in Cincinnati, Louisville, Evansville. Farmers checked their livestock in the mornings. Mothers stirred pots of soup on coal stoves. The Ohio River moved sluggishly past Pittsburgh, past Wheeling, past Portsmouth, collecting tributaries like veins feeding an artery. The Allegheny, the Monongahela, the Kanawha, the Scioto, the Licking, the Kentucky, the Wabash, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, each one swollen with winter melt and rain, each one pouring into the main channel. The river was already high by New Year's Day, higher than usual, but not alarming. Not yet. In Louisville, Reverend Walter Franklin Lahr prepared his church for Sunday services, his young son playing in the rectory. In Paducah, Kentucky, families along Broadway Street hung Christmas decorations, reluctant to take them down. In Portsmouth, Ohio, a woman named Bessie Tomlin watched the water inch up the flood wall. Fascinated by its steady creep, she had no way of knowing the wall would soon be irrelevant. By mid-January, the rain intensified into something biblical. Meteorologists later described it as a perfect storm of atmospheric conditions. Warm, moisture-laden air from the Gulf of Mexico colliding with cold fronts from Canada, stalling over the Ohio Valley like a stopped clock. The heaviest rainfall centered on the lower Ohio Valley between January 20th and 25, falling on soil so waterlogged that every drop became runoff. Farmers watched their fields turn to marshes. Roads became impassable. Telephone lines sagged under the weight of ice that formed when sleet followed the rain, snapping wires and cutting communication. On January 13th, the first serious warnings went out, but they were buried beneath daily concerns. The Great Depression still gripped the nation. Unemployment hovered near 20%. The Dust Bowl had not yet released its stranglehold on the heartland. People had larger worries than a little flooding. Besides, the Ohio had flooded before. It always receded. It always went back to where it belonged. But by January 18th, the river began to overflow its banks in earnest. Water crept into basements first, cold and oily, carrying the smell of mud and rot. Then it rose to first floors. Families moved furniture upstairs, mattresses, chairs, photograph albums wrapped in oilcloth. Some evacuation orders were issued, but they were voluntary, suggestions rather than commands. Many stayed, convinced the water would crest soon, convinced they had seen worse. They were wrong. On January 21st, the Ohio River rose 6 feet in a single day at Louisville. 6 feet, the height of a man, in 24 hours. The sound of it was everywhere now, not just the rain, but the river itself. A deep hydraulic roar as millions of gallons pushed against levees, pressed into streets, forced through cracks and foundations. Downtown Louisville began to flood. Water-filled alleys, then avenues, rising steadily, indifferently, swallowing fire hydrants, park benches, street signs. In Cincinnati, the river gauge climbed past 70 feet. Flood stage was 52. The waterfront district vanished first, then neighborhoods on low ground, then entire sections of the city. 100,000 people began to evacuate, carrying what they could in suitcases, in pillowcases, in their arms. Buses and trains ran on emergency schedules, packed with refugees heading north to higher ground, to Indianapolis, to Columbus, anywhere away from the swelling river that had stopped being a river and had become something else, a presence, a force, indifferent as gravity. On January 23rd, martial law was declared in Evansville, Indiana, where the water stood at 54 feet and rising. National Guard troops moved in, but they were overwhelmed almost immediately. There weren't enough boats. There weren't enough trucks. There weren't enough hands to carry the sandbags that split open and spilled into the floodwaters like futile prayers. The Works Progress Administration mobilized hundreds of workers, men already desperate for employment during the Depression, and sent them into the chaos with shovels and rope and little else. By January 24th, the entire Ohio River from Huntington, West Virginia to Cairo, Illinois, A distance of over 500 miles was above flood stage. Every city, every town, every hamlet along its course was either underwater or preparing to be. The magnitude was incomprehensible. Radio stations broadcast evacuation orders, but many stations lost power. Newspapers printed emergency editions by candlelight and kerosene lamp after electrical systems failed. The Courier-Journal in Louisville continued publishing even as water lapped at the building's foundation. Reporters typing in the dark, their words the only link between isolated communities and the outside world. On the night of January 24th at 11:37 p.m. Central Time, Louisville's power plant failed. The city plunged into absolute darkness. 230,000 people suddenly without light, without heat, without running water in the middle of a flood that showed no sign of stopping. The failure was sudden, total. One moment there were streetlights reflecting off the black water, the next nothing. Just the sound of the river, the rain, and distant voices calling in the dark. Families lit candles. The flames flickered in upstairs windows like distress signals. In the flooded lower floors, water continued to rise, cold and relentless, 6 inches an hour, carrying debris. Furniture, fence posts, chicken coops, the drowned bodies of livestock, and sometimes the bodies of people who had waited too long to leave. Rescue operations intensified into something close to warfare. The U.S. Coast Guard deployed its largest flood response operation in history. Over 800 personnel, 128 motor lifeboats, 68 rowboats, seaplanes dropping supplies to stranded communities. They rescued 839 people from immediate peril and transported 613 refugees to safety, working in shifts around the clock, navigating submerged streets by memory and instinct because all the landmarks were underwater. They saved 1,993 head of livestock, towed floating buildings to safety, carried mail to refugee centers, and prevented looting by their sheer presence in the devastated streets. On January 26th, Cincinnati's river gauge hit 79.9 feet, nearly 80 feet, 28 feet above flood stage, the highest level in the city's recorded history. There was speculation, never proven, that officials stopped measuring at 79.99 feet to avoid triggering double indemnity clauses in insurance contracts that would have bankrupted the companies. Whether true or not, the number itself, 79.99, became infamous, a decimal point away from catastrophe being recognized as apocalypse. The following day, January 27th, Louisville's river gauge reached 57 feet, shattering all previous records. 70% of the city was underwater, entire neighborhoods submerged, streets transformed into canals navigable only by boat, 40 feet of water above the normal river level. About 23,000 people had been evacuated from Louisville alone, but many more remained, stranded in attics, on rooftops, waving white cloths at passing rescue boats. If stories like this matter, subscribe, keep history alive. In Paducah, Kentucky, the situation was even more desperate. The city sat at the confluence of the Ohio and Tennessee rivers, a geographic trap that funneled water from 2 directions simultaneously. By January 19th, local officials ordered evacuations, but many residents, accustomed to seasonal flooding, ignored the warnings. They had lived along the river for generations. They knew its moods, or they thought they did. The water was icy, near freezing, and temperatures hovered in the teens. Cars stalled and froze in place as the flood advanced, becoming permanent obstacles in streets that were rapidly disappearing. Crude John boats and homemade rafts became the only means of transportation, piloted by men who had never navigated anything more challenging than a fishing pond. By February 2nd, the floodwaters in Paducah reached 60 feet in some areas. The entire downtown district was submerged. 27,000 residents, nearly the entire population, were displaced and forced to evacuate under military supervision. Governor A.B. Happy Chandler, who had been in Washington, D.C. for President Franklin Roosevelt's second inauguration, returned to Kentucky and personally helped evacuate residents, wading through waist-deep water, carrying children, supporting the elderly. But communication had collapsed. Telephone and telegraph lines were down. Radio stations had lost power. Families separated during the chaos had no way of knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. Refugee centers set up in schools, churches, and gymnasiums became information hubs where people posted handwritten notes on walls, looking for Mary Evans, last seen on Broadway, messages scrawled in desperation, waiting for answers that sometimes never came. On January 29th, the State Board of Health of Kentucky issued a mandatory evacuation order for all flooded areas. The order was printed on handbills and posted on trees, lampposts, flagpoles, anything higher than the water, and read verbatim to anyone who refused to leave. Military units were authorized to remove people by force if necessary. It was not a request. It was a command issued in the face of a disaster that had exceeded all predictions, all preparations, all comprehension. The flood affected 12 states. Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and parts of Kansas. Over 1 million people were left homeless, 1 in every 130 Americans displaced in a matter of weeks. In the Cincinnati tri-state area alone, 100,000 were homeless. The scale was staggering. Entire towns along the river simply vanished, erased by water that stood for days, for weeks, dissolving foundations, collapsing walls, turning streets into silt-choked lagoons. In Portsmouth, Ohio, only one person was officially recorded as a flood victim in the city, Bessie Tomlin, who had watched the water rise with such fascination in the early days. She was in a rescue boat when it capsized in the frigid current. Her death, singular and documented, became emblematic of the countless others who drowned in isolated pockets of the valley, in rural areas where no one was counting, where bodies were swept downstream and never recovered. The official death toll was 385. But that number, like the 79.99 feet in Cincinnati, was almost certainly an undercount. Many victims were never found. Others died weeks later from pneumonia, from disease contracted in the filthy water, from injuries sustained during evacuations. Some simply disappeared. Tenant farmers, transients, people living on the margins of the Depression economy, who were already invisible before the flood made them more so. By early February, the rain finally stopped. The sky cleared, pale and cold, revealing the magnitude of what had happened. The water began to recede slowly, reluctantly, as if the river itself was surprised by what it had done. On February 5th, the Ohio River fell below flood stage for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. What remained was devastation on a scale difficult to comprehend. In Louisville, 65 square miles of Jefferson County were inundated. Property damage exceeded $250 million in Kentucky alone, over $11 billion when adjusted for inflation. And that was just one state among 12. Houses were collapsed or tilted at grotesque angles, their foundations scoured away. Businesses were destroyed, their inventories ruined by mud and sewage-contaminated water. Farmland was buried under feet of sediment. Livestock losses were catastrophic. Thousands of cattle, pigs, horses drowned or starved on isolated patches of high ground. The psychological damage was harder to quantify, but equally profound. Families who had lost everything stood in the muddy ruins of their homes, staring at water lines on walls that marked how high the river had risen, 10 feet, 12 feet, 15 feet above the floor, and tried to comprehend the randomness of survival. Some had been rescued from second-story windows by boat. Others had floated on makeshift rafts for hours in the darkness, waiting for help that almost didn't come. Reverend Walter Franklin Lair, who stayed in Jeffersonville, Indiana, throughout the disaster, documented the flood's progress with obsessive detail. He described how the water entered buildings, how communities prepared, how people responded when the familiar world dissolved into liquid chaos. His testimony, recorded decades later, captured the surreal normality of catastrophe, how people adapted, made jokes, found ways to survive even as the river swallowed their city. In Paducah, a child named Malcolm Mack Meadows was born during the height of the flood, delivered in an evacuation center while water stood 60 feet high outside. His birth certificate listed his place of birth simply as Paducah, Kentucky, during the flood of 1937. A notation that carried the weight of history in a single phrase. The flood occurred at the absolute worst moment in American history. The nation was still mired in the Great Depression. 1 in 5 workers was unemployed. Banks were fragile. Government resources were stretched thin. The Dust Bowl was decimating agriculture across the Great Plains. And now this, a natural disaster of unprecedented scope striking the industrial and agricultural heartland of the country. Federal and state response was immediate but overwhelmed. President Franklin Roosevelt authorized emergency relief funds. The Works Progress Administration sent thousands of workers to assist with evacuations, sandbag operations, and later, the monumental task of cleanup and rebuilding. The Red Cross mobilized its entire Midwest operation, establishing refugee centers that housed and fed hundreds of thousands of displaced people. The Civilian Conservation Corps deployed 205 members to Paducah alone to assist with evacuations and security. But the scale was simply too vast. There weren't enough boats, enough trucks, enough shelter, enough food. Supplies were airlifted to isolated communities, dropped from planes into schoolyards that had become islands surrounded by miles of floodwater. In some towns, people went days without fresh water, ironic and cruel, surrounded by a river that had become undrinkable, contaminated with sewage, industrial waste, and decomposing animal carcasses. Diseases spread quickly in the aftermath: typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia. Refugee centers, crowded and unsanitary, became breeding grounds for illness. Medical supplies ran short. Doctors and nurses worked until they collapsed, treating frostbite, hypothermia, injuries from collapsing buildings, and the psychological trauma of people who had watched their entire lives wash away in a matter of hours. Someone had known, someone had warned. The flood did not come without precedent or warning. The Ohio River had flooded catastrophically in 1913, killing hundreds and displacing thousands. Engineers had warned for decades that the levee and flood control systems along the river were inadequate for a truly major flood. Reports had been written, plans had been proposed, but during the Depression there was no money for ambitious infrastructure projects, and politicians were reluctant to spend on hypothetical disasters when tangible crises, unemployment, bank failures, agricultural collapse, demanded immediate attention. The warnings were in the meteorological data as well. By mid-January, it was clear that rainfall totals were approaching historic levels. The soil saturation maps showed no capacity for absorption. River gauges were rising at alarming rates. But the infrastructure for disseminating warnings was primitive. No television, limited radio coverage, newspapers that reached rural areas days late. And even when warnings were issued, they were often vague, couched in bureaucratic language that failed to convey urgency. In Portsmouth, Ohio, letters from the period described residents walking downtown to watch the flood wall, treating the rising water as entertainment, a spectacle. One woman wrote to family members describing the water's slow creep with almost literary fascination, noting when it reached 73 feet, then 74, wondering in her letter when it would finally crest, comparing it to the 1913 flood, and expressing confusion that it hadn't stopped yet. Her words captured a cognitive dissonance, the inability to comprehend that this flood was fundamentally different, that the river had no intention of stopping at the expected levels, that all historical precedent was about to be obliterated. By the time mandatory evacuations were ordered, it was almost too late. Roads were already impassable, bridges were underwater or deemed structurally unsafe. Trains could only run to the edge of the flood zone, where refugees had to be transferred to boats for the final legs of their journey to safety. One special train brought 546 evacuees from Portsmouth to higher ground, families carrying everything they owned in pillowcases and cardboard boxes, children crying, parents staring out windows at a landscape transformed into a vast inland sea. The evacuation of Louisville was particularly harrowing because it occurred in total darkness after the power failure. Rescue boats navigated by flashlight and lantern, shouting at windows, listening for responses from stranded residents. Some boats capsized in the current, which was deceptively strong even in areas where the water appeared calm. Rescuers worked in shifts, pulling people from attics, from rooftops, from second-story windows, ferrying them to makeshift evacuation points where buses and trucks waited to transport them to shelters miles away. The photographs from the period are almost surreal in their calm horror. Downtown Cincinnati with water lapping at second-story windows. Louisville's 4th Street underwater, street signs poking above the surface like grave markers. Paducah's Broadway Avenue transformed into a river within a river. Boats rowing past storefronts where goods still hung in windows behind glass that somehow hadn't shattered. The images show not violence but inundation, a slow, thorough erasure of the human landscape by water that had no malice, only volume and patience. Animals suffered horribly. Cattle stood on shrinking patches of high ground, surrounded by water, lowing in distress as rescue boats passed, unable to save them. Horses drowned in their stalls. Pigs floated past rescue workers, bloated and stiff. The Coast Guard saved nearly 2,000 head of livestock. But that was a fraction of the total losses. Farmers who evacuated returned weeks later to find their barns collapsed, their fields buried under silt, their animals dead or missing. The flood's impact on infrastructure was catastrophic and long-lasting. Bridges were destroyed or damaged. Railroad lines were washed out. Water treatment plants were submerged and contaminated. Electrical systems were ruined. Telephone and telegraph lines were down across hundreds of miles. In many communities, basic services took months to restore. Louisville didn't regain full electrical power for weeks. By mid-February, the water had finally receded enough for people to return to what remained of their homes. What they found was mud, thick, gray, foul-smelling mud that coated everything, mixed with sewage and industrial waste and decomposing organic matter. Houses had to be shoveled out, literally shoveled room by room, bucketful by bucketful. Furniture was ruined, wallpaper hung in strips, floors were warped beyond repair. The smell was overwhelming, rot and mildew and chemicals and death. The cleanup took months, then years. Entire neighborhoods were condemned. Some towns were never rebuilt. Families who had lived in the same house for generations were suddenly homeless, living in tents provided by the Red Cross, waiting for government assistance that was slow to arrive because the government itself was broke. But the flood changed policy in ways that resonated for decades. In 1938, just 1 year after the disaster, Congress passed the Flood Control Act, committing federal resources to flood prevention and management on an unprecedented scale. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was tasked with designing and constructing comprehensive flood control systems for the Ohio River and its tributaries. In Louisville, construction of the Ohio River Flood Protection System began in 1948 and took nearly 40 years to complete. The flood wall stretches for 29 miles, protecting 110 square miles from future floods. 16 pumping stations move stormwater from the protected area into the river. Similar systems were built in Cincinnati, Evansville, Paducah, and dozens of other communities along the Ohio. The 1937 flood remains the flood of record for many locations along the Ohio River. Despite numerous floods in the decades since, in 1964, 1997, 2011, none have approached the scale and devastation of 1937. The flood control systems built in its aftermath have largely worked, protecting millions of people who live and work in the floodplain, often unaware of the risk, but survivors never forgot. For those who lived through it, the flood became the defining event of their lives, the moment when the world revealed its capacity for sudden, total transformation. One survivor, interviewed decades later, described it as the story of my dad's boyhood. Capitalized, absolute, overshadowing everything else. Another survivor recalled being rescued from an upstairs bedroom window. A 5-year-old child lifted into a boat by strangers, while her mother wept. Rust now covers the old flood gauges in Cincinnati and Louisville. Markers frozen at historic levels, 79, 99 feet, 57 feet. Numbers that mean nothing to most people, but everything to those who remember. On January 27th each year, local historians give talks at libraries and historical societies showing photographs of streets that are now dry, describing a disaster that recedes further into the past with each passing year. In Paducah, a memorial stands near the river, listing the names of those who died. The wind moves through it, carrying the sound of water from the Ohio River just beyond. A river that looks calm now, contained within its banks, behaving itself. But the memorial knows what the river did, what it could do again if the rain fell long enough, hard enough if the dams failed or the flood walls cracked, or the climate changed in ways that exceeded all calculations. Malcolm Mack Meadows, the child born during the flood, lived his entire life in the Ohio River Valley, carrying the flood as his origin story. His birth certificate was his credential, born during the worst natural disaster in the region's history, proof that life continued even in the midst of catastrophe. The Great Flood of 1937 killed 385 people officially, left 1 million homeless, destroyed $500 million in property, and shattered the illusion that humans had dominion over nature. It revealed the Ohio River not as a resource or a boundary, but as a force, ancient, patient, and utterly indifferent to the cities and farms and lives built along its banks. The flood lasted 3 weeks from start to finish, 21 days of rain, rising water, evacuation, rescue, death, and slow recession. But its echo lasted much longer. It rewrote policy, redesigned cities, and permanently altered the relationship between the Ohio River Valley and the river itself. The flood walls that now line the river are not decorative. They are promises or threats, reminders that the river refused once to stay in its banks, and no one who lived through 1937 believed it couldn't happen again. One survivor, in a letter written during the flood, described watching the water rise past the flood wall, past the second-story windows, past all the marks from previous floods, and writing a single question: when will this end? The question hung unanswered in the cold January air, drowned out by the sound of the river that had stopped listening. The blast of water ended in seconds of geological time, but its echo rewrote decades. If this story moved you, subscribe and keep its echo alive.